When the average person thinks of the word superhero, the first thing that usually comes to mind is Superman, or at least a variation of him. You know, a super strong guy who flies around in a spandex costume, complete with a cape. But for a time, there was one hero that gave the Man of Tomorrow a major run for his money, even outselling him too: Captain Marvel. This is the story of how DC Comics use all of their legal power to kill this once beloved icon, and take his remaining corpse for themselves to reanimate it into the hero known today as Shazam, creating one of the most famous and important lawsuits in all of comic book history, which has led to a domino effect of backstabs and pettiness that is still being acted upon to this day. You might have heard bits of this story before, but I guarantee that I have found some pretty juicy details that have slipped under most people's radar. Hello and welcome to Comic Drake, where I talk about comic books and my name is Drake. Let's talk about it. But before we get too far into things, I need to give a big thank you to the sponsor of today's video, Felix Gray. As someone who spends a lot of time looking at screens, I've definitely felt a ton of eye strain, dryness, and trouble sleeping, which is why I've been trying to better manage how I interact with technology, and blue light blocking glasses have been a huge help in that regard. Felix Gray makes good-looking, lightweight, durable, and most importantly, comfortable glasses, which can filter 15 times more blue light than normal lenses. Today, I am wearing the Hamilton frames, but there are all sorts of great-looking styles on their websites that are available in both prescription and not. The glasses are also very reasonably priced, so if you've been looking to get a new pair, then consider giving Felix Gray a shot, especially since they have a 30-day money-back guarantee. Just click the link in the description down below and enjoy. Thank you very much, Felix Gray, for sponsoring the video, but now, let's get back to it. In April of 1938, the world was changed forever when Superman hit the scenes in Action Comics #1, creating the first superhero as we know them today, and everyone wanted a piece of the pie. Many publishers made their own characters that were either inspired or straight-up rip-offs of the Man of Steel. Most importantly for today's video, Fawcett Comics. At this point, everyone knows Superman's original power set.
Faster than a speeding bullet. More powerful than a locomotive. Able to leap tall buildings at a single bound. The infant of Krypton is now the Man of Steel, Superman.
Fawcett's new superhero Masterman was pretty similar to Soup's, as he was, quote, stronger than untamed horses, swifter than raging winds, braver than mighty lions, wiser than wisdom, and as kind as Galahad. Well, National Comics, DC's original name, wasn't too happy about Masterman and other characters like him, so they started getting trigger happy with both cease and desists and lawsuits. When Fawcett got word from National to cut it out with Masterman, they canceled the book. But they decided to get right back into the game by tapping writer Bill Parker to create a new competing comic. Inspired by the Knights of the Round Table, Parker envisioned a team of heroes, each with their own unique powers, led by one Captain Thunder, with each member of the team's name combining out to spell the battle cry, Shazam. Fun fact, this seems to be the origin of the literal word Shazam, which has since gone on to become pretty popular to say the least, especially in that alternate universe where that Sinbad movie was made. However, editor Ralph Daig wasn't a fan of the team concept, so Parker just mushed all the characters together into one new hero that would change the course of comic history forever. With art by C.C. Beck, Parker's new hero saw his debut in 1939 in Whiz Comics #2, with the greatest alter ego of all time, which is something that I think has still never been topped. Instead of having a child sidekick that young readers could see themselves in, Fawcett made the kid character into the hero, with young Billy Batson, a down-on-his-luck orphan, meeting a wizard who granted him the ability to turn into an adult superhero, with the powers of wisdom, strength, stamina, power, courage, and speed whenever he said the word Shazam. Because of trademarking issues, Billy's heroic form couldn't be called Captain Thunder, so the name Captain Marvelous was pitched before being shortened to the much catchier Captain Marvel. Also, this dude's most famous nickname is the Big Red Cheese. Definitely not as badass as the Caped Crusader, Man of Steel, or even Scarlet Speedster. But anyway, Whiz Comics was an instant success, spinning onto other books such as Captain Marvel Adventures, Captain Marvel Jr., Mary Marvel, WoW Comics, Master Comics, and the Marvel family. Hell, there was even Hoppy the Marvel Bunny, because comics. The character's popularity only grew over the years, until his solo book became the best-selling comic in the entire market, which Fawcett was more than happy to advertise by putting the largest circulation of any comic magazine right there on the front cover. In a surprising move, National Comics, which at this point was more or less known as DC, didn't come after Captain Marvel, even though the comic was their main competition, and the company had a track record of shutting down similar characters, even from Fawcett. But all of that changed when Little Billy Batson became the first superhero to be adapted into a live-action movie.
Shazam!
The company that made the film, Republic Pictures, initially had a deal with DC to produce a Superman movie, but because of an existing contract with Paramount Pictures for the Superman animated series, they couldn't move forward, prompting Republic to go with Captain Marvel instead. Possibly due to their hero continuously overshadowing Superman at every turn, DC finally sent Fawcett a cease and desist. But when they refused to stop publication, DC pulled the trigger at last and took them to court in 1941. And hoping to get some money from the Captain Marvel movie, they also sued Republic Pictures as a co-defendant. But before the lawsuit could go to court, a little thing called the bombing of Pearl Harbor happened, which got in the way with the United States entering World War II, putting off the trial. During the war, both Captain Marvel and Superman continued to sell really well, oftentimes devolving into political propaganda for the war effort, complete with racist depictions of the Japanese. But when the dust settled and the Axis was defeated, this supersuit was finally able to have its day in court. With the truly mesmerizing amount of popularity that both heroes had, the legal battle between DC and Fawcett was one of, if not the biggest court case in all of comic history at the time. No stone was left unturned, and every aspect of the two heroes was put under a magnifying glass. Both heroes wore skin-tight costumes with boots and a cape, they both had secret identities that were reporters. Hell, it was even debated that the two had clean-cut faces, and that was enough of a similarity. Years after the lawsuit, editor Roscoe K. Fawcett himself admitted in an interview that, quote, "The survey showed the greatest comic book readership was among 10 to 12-year-old boys. I said, give me a Superman, only have his other identity be a 10 to 12-year-old boy rather than a grown man." But in litigation, Fawcett Comics argued that both heroes' great feats of strength, durability, and agility couldn't be deemed as wholly original, as many mythological heroes like Hercules, whom Captain Marvel actually draws his strength from, and even other popular characters like Popeye have exhibited superhuman abilities. It's also worth noting that when it comes to flying, Captain Marvel actually had Superman beat by a couple of years. Remember, he was only
able to leap tall buildings at a single bound.
So it's pretty clear that DC was inspired by Fawcett as well. In the end, the ruling was surprising to say the least. The court found that the Big Red Cheese was indeed similar enough to Superman to be considered copyright infringement. But Fawcett still won the lawsuit. See, what had happened is that DC forgot to properly copyright some of their Superman newspaper strips, which resulted in them abandoning their copyright. So it really didn't matter if anyone made their own Superman or Superman-like character. Also, this ruling got Republic Pictures off the hook, and DC had to cover their attorney's fees. Naturally, DC appealed the verdict, and it was overturned in 1951 when the judge ruled that DC didn't abandon their copyright for Superman as a character, rather just the copyright on those specific newspaper strips. At this point in time, though, superhero comics were massively on the decline thanks to a national outrage over them supposedly corrupting children. So instead of continuing to battle DC in court, Fawcett agreed to stop publishing superhero books altogether and settled for $400,000. Oh, but they did sell the rights to reprint Hoppy the Marvel Bunny to Charlton Comics, who renamed him Happy the Magic Bunny. Fawcett's decision to cancel their whole line of superhero comics had a huge impact on the UK market, considering that old Captain Marvel reprints were a massive cash cow for a company called L. Miller & Sons. And to make up for no longer being able to sell those comics, they needed to get creative. The story there is actually its own separate can of worms that I'll be making a dedicated video on, because that entire thing is just bonkers. It's probably the single most interesting piece of comic book legal drama of all time, led to some of the darkest superhero comics ever made, and is going to be my biggest video yet. I've had to comb through a ton of pages of legal documents, 2 whole books of the history, and literal decades worth of comic book publications and blogs to really capture all of the twists and turns of that massive story. You're not going to want to miss it, so if you haven't already done so, make sure to subscribe to get notified. But as exciting as all of that is, the tale of Captain Marvel still has a lot to talk about, and things are about to get even more interesting. With Fawcett's Captain Marvel out of the picture, a company called MF Enterprises decided to swoop on in and start publishing one of their own in 1966 out of pure spite. But the target of this attack wasn't Fawcett or even DC, but rather another company entirely, Timely Comics. Timely got into the superhero game with their debut hero, the Human Torch, an android who could ignite into flames. Well, the Torch's creator, Carl Burgos, was pretty ticked off that Timely kept a hold of the copyright for his baby, and decided to create this new Captain Marvel, an android with the ability to detach parts of his body, as a middle finger to his former employer. See, as you might have guessed, Timely rebranded over the years, becoming Atlas and eventually Marvel Comics. And these guys were trademarking anything they could think of that included the word Marvel, which of course included, say it with me, Captain Marvel. Well, Burgos was able to beat them to the punch with this new hero, and seemingly wanted to get back at the entire industry that had scorned him by ripping off everybody he could think of. His Captain Marvel was the sole survivor of a doomed planet a la Superman, had a child sidekick named Billy Baxton, and fought villains with similar names and even similar powers of already established characters, including Plastic Man, Dr. Fate, the Destroyer, and the Bat, who was totally just Batman, so they changed his name to The Ray, which is another character that already existed. Marvel offered MF Enterprises $6,000 for the trademark, but they refused. So Marvel retaliated by making a Captain Marvel of their own. This character was an alien spy named Mar-Vell, who went down to Earth, and when people misunderstood his name, he was given the moniker Captain Marvel. MF certainly didn't appreciate that, so they sued Marvel Comics for trademark infringement, later agreeing to drop the case altogether for a now reduced $4,500. With this victory under Marvel's belt, that should be the end of this whole nonsense, right? No. Because guess who's back? It's DC Comics with the steel chair! So over at DC, they decided to take advantage of Fawcett not being allowed to publish their superhero comics for a couple of decades, and got the rights to license the characters. Yeah, DC was the entire reason that Fawcett stopped in the first place, and they had the damn audacity to do this. I mean, I get the whole adage of if you can't beat them, join them, but wow. Though, imagine how wild it would be if MF never entered this conversation and it was Marvel who decided to snatch up these licenses as a screw you to DC instead of creating Mar-Vell. Unfortunately though, we don't live in that timeline. And when trying to figure out what to do with their newly licensed characters, DC came to the conclusion that Fawcett's goofy old Captain Marvel wasn't really a good fit for the kind of stories that they were currently putting out. So the licensed Fawcett books were relegated to their own self-contained universe. Though to try out the idea of incorporating the Big Red Cheese into the DC universe proper, they made a stand-in for him in the Superman comic with the character Captain Thunder, a callback to Fawcett's original name for the hero. Look, I get that at this point in time, DC did have the official license to the character, but it's pretty ironic that they would blatantly do this, considering their whole history of claiming that Captain Marvel was a ripoff of Superman. And quick side note here, but while I was editing the video, I found this page from a Shazam comic, which has this Captain Thunder and a reference to the MF Enterprises Captain Marvel. It's just such a huge treat for those of us that know all about this crazy legal history. All of that aside though, there was one major hurdle for DC to overcome before they could release their Captain Marvel book: the title. And that means that we're going to need a quick lesson on the differences between trademarks and copyrights. While copyright protects an original work and intellectual property, a trademark protects branding. This means that even though both Marvel and DC had heroes that were called Captain Marvel, they were different enough so that both characters could legally be published at the same time, since nobody would reasonably think that the two characters are one and the same. As a result, this means that both heroes are allowed to be referred to as Captain Marvel inside of their respective books, but the comic's title is a whole different story entirely, and only one publisher is allowed to use it. Since Marvel had the title first, they got the trademark, thus forcing DC to pick a new title for their Captain Marvel comic. DC settled on Shazam for the title, the word that Billy Batson uses to transform, but they were able to put the original Captain Marvel right there on the cover. That is, until Marvel got pissed off and made them remove it by issue 15. But here's the funny thing about trademarks. In order for a company to keep one, they need to continuously use it. And this put Marvel in a position where they were forced to really try and make their Captain Marvel a thing, which is why in 1968, Mar-Vell got his very own comic, which didn't sell very well. Honestly, sales of Captain Marvel have never really been all that great, even when they tried changing up the characters that had the mantle like Monica Rambeau and Mar-Vell's son, Genis. This finally changed in 2012 though when Carol Danvers took over the mantle after being quite popular as Miss Marvel for years. So now, Marvel is finally making good money off of the Captain Marvel name and isn't pumping out comics solely to keep the trademark. DC Shazam Comics saw the return of original Captain Marvel artist C.C. Beck, but he quickly wasn't a fan of how the company was handling his character. Beck eventually left over these creative differences, stating in an editorial that DC was, quote, trying to kill Captain Marvel, bury him, and drive a stake through his lifeless body. The release of Shazam was exciting for comic fans at the time, as Captain Marvel had become something of an urban legend, a long-forgotten hero with so much legal history behind him that he seemed taboo. But when what readers got was a hokey, old-fashioned hero that wasn't anything like the more serious books of the era, which catered to older audiences with darker and more political themes, Shazam quickly fell out of favor. The licensing deal that DC struck with Fawcett required them to pay up every time that one of their characters was used, so when the Shazam series ended, DC wasn't all that excited to keep paying them to use the characters more often. Eventually though, DC did buy the rights to Captain Marvel and his supporting cast outright, later followed by the purchase of Fawcett itself. And that brings us to 1985, when the iconic event Crisis on Infinite Earths blew through the company like a hurricane. This series served two purposes: to streamline the company's increasingly convoluted continuity, and to bring characters from other companies that DC had acquired over the years into the DC universe proper. It was suggested by Roy Thomas, who, fun fact, was the writer of the first solo series from Marvel back when he worked at Marvel, suggested that this would be a great opportunity to finally put all of that trademark nonsense to bed by reworking the character into a new Captain Thunder, an African-American kid in a wheelchair named Willie Fawcett. Obviously, this never ended up happening, which is a real shame because honestly, Captain Thunder is just a much better name all around, and it would really drive home his lightning powers. But then again, that would be like another entry in the trope of black characters with electric powers. Why even is that a thing? Huh. I should really do research into that and make its own separate video. That sounds good. Lightning. Anyway, it wouldn't be until DC's second reboot, Flashpoint, that their Captain Marvel would finally get renamed, officially becoming Shazam. At long last, this whole debacle over the name could finally be put to rest, and it's a change that just made sense. As writer Geoff Johns explained in an interview, quote, "Everybody thinks he's called Shazam already outside of comics." But here's the thing. This decision is also pretty damn stupid, since Shazam logically shouldn't be able to say his own name without changing back to Billy Batson. And don't try to tell me that's a dumb concern, because this very conundrum was played around with pre-Flashpoint by Captain Marvel Jr., whose magic words are Captain Marvel instead of Shazam since he gets his powers directly from Billy and not the wizard. It's a whole thing. The solution in the reboot was that in order for Billy to make his magic word work, he has to say it with meaning and conviction as if it were a magic spell. And fine, that makes sense. Now, although this is the end of this whole crazy saga, I did mention earlier in the video that the second part of this is way more fascinating, and it's what I consider to be the biggest series of lawsuits in all of comic history. Like I said, it's going to be my biggest video yet, and if you enjoyed this, then you really won't want to miss it, so please consider subscribing. But anyway, I hope you learned at least a little something new, and hopefully, I'll see you next time.